Hey everyone. So like Allie and Paige, I'm also going to be presenting something that I did for a course that I took last term. And this is for Paige Fisher's course on social vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. And the final project for this course was to choose a community of that we were interested in and then to assess their social vulnerability. So I chose Marin City, California because I've worked in this community through internships and have been struck by how different it is from your traditional Bay Area community and how despite systematic inequalities in Marin City, or maybe because of them, that how they are approaching resilience planning in a much more community-based bottom-up approach. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about what social vulnerability is. It's kind of like a framework of looking at communities and just like the quick and dirty one of what we talked about in class is that there's 3 components to social vulnerability. The first is exposure, which is kind of like a potential for stress in a community, so thinking about natural hazards and what kind of things may adversely impact people. The next part is sensitivity, which is describing the potential degree of impact. And this is where we kind of start to think about the more socioeconomic conditions and cultural conditions that might cause some people to be more heavily impacted than others, and also have more difficulty in recovering from these shocks. And then the third part is adaptive capacity, which is kind of the potential to maintain or increase well-being. And this is kind of mostly dependent on a community's access to resource and information that would help them mitigate the impacts and take advantage of other opportunities such as like migration. And I also do want to acknowledge the fraught term of vulnerable. Characterizing communities, especially those that I'm not a part of, as vulnerable can have harmful consequences on communities. It can generate misguided actions and policy responses based on these outsiders' perceptions of these communities. And these outsiders' perceptions can then also spill over into community self-perception, and which would ultimately hinder their efforts to gain autonomy over their own actions. So with these considerations in mind, I'd like to clarify that I'm not characterizing Marin City as vulnerable, but more like describing the elements of Marin City that cause it to have a higher level of social vulnerability than that in the surrounding communities. So, Marin City is located in the Bay Area. It's about 5 miles north of San Francisco. It's a small, historically African-American suburb with a large proportion of Marin County's public and subsidized housing. Marin County is a county well above state levels of wealth, well-being, and access to opportunities. Marin City itself is home to about 3,000, and it's a town small enough where you can walk across it in less than an hour. So the history of Marin City is, it is Coast Miwok land, and then it became Sleepy Ranch land, and most of the development occurred during World War II when there was a huge push for shipyards. And that's what you see in the community kind of to the left, where all the dorms and apartments and kind of other infrastructure built to support these people. And then after World War II ended, a lot of people kind of dispersed out of the area, but a large proportion of the Black population in Marin City was unable to move out due to discriminatory housing practices within the Bay Area, which meant that they couldn't get housing anywhere else. And eventually, the development in Marin City was not meant to be permanent, and so it has been seeing years of increasing dilapidation because of years of neglect. And so there have been new housing projects, and that's kind of what the community looks like nowadays, but there's still no post office, no grocery store, not really much of a commercial center, and there's other factors that have also led to its social vulnerability. So kind of going through the framework of social vulnerability that I outlined earlier. So in terms of exposure, Marin City is pretty close to the Bay Area or close to the water and experiences king tides, which are unusually high levels of tides. There's also sea level rise, storm surges, and the town itself is bowl-shaped and nestled up against mountains. There's also, when you combine that with some damaged storm infrastructure that gets flooded and clogged every single time it rains, and the fact that there's only one way in and out of the community, limited health services within the community, there's no grocery store, and that the most of the population are low-income community of colors with high percentage of renters. That in typical social vulnerability frameworks would lead to quite a lot of cause for concern, but there are a good number of communities coalitions who are thinking about and wanting to bring Marin City to the level of the rest of the county. So in doing my research, I found a good number of reports done by these community coalitions, and I'd like to highlight one of them. So this report was published through a collaboration between Shore Up Marin, which is an environmental justice collaborative that believes in the equitable inclusion of low-income communities in planning disaster preparedness, especially with flooding and hazard mitigation. And they collaborated with Resilient by Design, which is a regional design challenge that aims to use public-private partnerships. And they together generated the People's Plan of Marin City, which addresses the norms of planning and development through community engagement, because they've acknowledged that traditional modes of community engagement are typically ineffective, full of technical jargon, and tend to overlook the community's own capacity for generating and expressing their own self-determined solutions. So together they expanded existing knowledge for assessing and addressing risks, and so they addressed a lot of the flooding and a lot of the exposure and sensitivity elements that I described before. And together they recruited a multi-generational cohort within Marin City. In over 3 months, they learned how to spread, sink, and store floodwater, and they mapped flooding areas, created solutions that, even though it might seem like it would need a lot of technical advice, can be done by the communities themselves. And the result is that they planned an intergenerational garden that addressed hillside erosion and also provided vegetation, provided open space, and also access to community healthy foods. So yeah, this is just one way to reaffirm the hypothesis that communities themselves have the skills, experiences, and strategies to solve their own local problems, and that we just need to give them the capacity. So yeah, thanks.